Hey, Drew. Look forward to talking today about EVs and picking your brain about some of what we're seeing in the policy and regulatory landscape. So glad to have you here.
Glad to be here. And EVs are a very hot topic right now. I think with the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits, and the states are getting involved. That's kind of the area that I work in, is the state legislative and regulatory area, and we've seen a lot of action in that area in the last couple of years.
And to that point, I mean, so some of the things that commissions are grappling with are these, big policy questions about who should own electric vehicles, who's going to pay for and build out the infrastructure. Some of those big questions I think would be fun, good for us to talk about today. And I guess to that point, what have you been seeing in terms of ownership and who owns EVs and who is allowed to own EVs throughout the states?
I think the ownership's in flux. They're becoming more adopted, even in rural areas here in Georgia and across the country. I feel like some people have very optimistic forecasts for adoption, and some people are less optimistic, but it's certainly happening. Maybe not to the extent some people think, or maybe more than others think. So it's something that I think utilities and policymakers need to know about and need to prepare for.
In terms of, I guess, from a legislative standpoint of ownership, we've seen around the country, lots of legislation pop up that address these issues, and I know that that's something that we work on together from the legislative aspect. Is there, kind of trends or big policy points about the legislation in this area that you could speak to?
Well, one thing we've seen is something that really, as a person who works for electric utilities, we didn't anticipate is maybe some potential legislation, some ideas from other stakeholders that you normally don't think of in the utility space. We've seen legislation in Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma. I've worked closely here in Georgia on legislation that was put forward mainly supported by convenience stores, both your local mom and pop convenience stores and the national chains, that dealt with some of the issues that they have with the electric vehicle transformation and things that, frankly, us who work at utilities didn't really think about. I think a good example of that is competition. A lot of utilities, or at least most of the utilities I work with, don't really see themselves as competing with convenience stores. But of course, the convenience stores who are in the business of fueling vehicles, now mainly by gasoline, but possibly in the future with electricity, do see themselves as the rightful people that should meet this need in the marketplace. So, there were challenges that utilities, I think, faced that they may not have anticipated.
So from a legislative perspective, I guess that issues were arising that probably utilities have never faced before. And I guess, when you think about the resolutions, and I think about how a bill becomes a law, are there ways that utilities or stakeholders that you've seen resolved some of those issues that I guess was in the best interest for all stakeholders to kind of move the ball forward with EV adoption?
I think so. I think a big point is to get all the stakeholders in a room and to talk about it. But specifically, we were concerned with, well, I should put it this way. The convenience stores in the marketplace are there to make money, to make a profit. And so they view rural areas and underserved areas as not necessarily the market where they're going to make the most revenue. I think it's very similar to broadband adoption. We've seen across the country broadband adoption in urban areas, suburban areas. It's sort of lagged in low income and in rural areas. And the utilities I work with also see a place for themselves in those potentially underserved areas. I think the marketplace wants to serve interstate corridors. I think they want to be involved in cities and suburbs. But in a lot of states, you have areas that are not close to interstates, do not have urban areas.
Right.
And I think there's a place for utilities in that area.
We've talked about, and broadband is an area where in some jurisdictions, commissions, public utility commissions may have jurisdiction or may not, depending. And that's one of the issues that in the EV space, some commissions have grappled with. I know that, and states don't always come out with the same resolution. I think that there are situations in Maryland, for instance, where the commission did find that basically under their broad authority to regulate public utilities, but in other instances, and I guess one that we've talked about before is Alabama, where the Alabama Commission found that under their governing statute they didn't have authority to regulate EVs. Is that something also, I know that from the commission perspective that's going on, is that something that also would be or could be addressed through legislation?
I think that's a great point. And when you think about it, we have 50 states and 50 different utility regulation regimes. And so, some states, I think, felt like they had the authority to either take jurisdiction or say they have no jurisdiction over EV charging services. You mentioned two good examples there of things we saw in the state. But some states do need changes in their laws, maybe service territory regulations.
Right.
Sometimes it deals with rate regulations, and just the retail sale of electricity. And there needs to be adjustments there in some circumstances. So I really think that some states probably do require legislation, and then you've got some states that the legislation is not required.
So as we continue working with our clients who are kind of, from all perspectives in different markets and different jurisdictions, and they're grappling with how to, resolve some of these issues, what are some kind of key takeaways, I guess, in going into an EV discussion, whether it's from a policy perspective or a legislative perspective that we might want our clients to know about?
I think in terms of some of the people we work with, we found some innovative solutions to help with the stakeholders and address some of their concerns. For example, I think there's room to have something that some places call a community charging program, where the utility is only allowed to operate in maybe rural and economically disadvantaged areas, or maybe there's limitations on where the utility can put utility-owned charging services into the ground. I will say that all stakeholders we work with want to participate with the utility for make-ready funds, and they need help with the infrastructure that gets the electricity to the charging station. So there's also room for utilities to be heavily involved in that area, and the stakeholders appreciate it as well.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point you mentioned that, we do have 50 states and there are almost like 50 different labs. And I think that each state is going to be addressing these issues from a different point in the race. There's states like, I think Florida comes to mind, where they've some of this infrastructure, some of these preliminary questions have already been addressed, where there may be other areas of the country where this is kind of a novel first time issue that they're addressing. So,
yeah, no, that's a good point. I think some states and some utilities are further along in this potential transformation than others. I think what we're seeing is some of the marketplace reaction, I think, to some of the utilities in some of the states that are still starting to grapple with these issues and these questions.
All right, well, I've enjoyed the chance to pick your brain. I know that we'll be continue to talk about these issues. Thanks for the chat.
Certainly, and thanks for having me, Josh.